Who was whispering into their ear in that church? What was sitting behind her in that car? How did her house phone call her cell phone when nobody else was home? The final story in today's video is quite honestly one of the creepiest stories I've ever come across, so make sure you watch until the end. Please don't forget to like and subscribe as it helps the channel out big time. Let's get into the stories. I'm your host, Severed Soul. Ever since I was young, I've always had a sense of spirits being around me. My parents tell me stories of when I was a kid that would really freak them out. So I decided to share a couple of them here. My grandpa died when my dad was about 15 years old. There was one particular day. We were visiting my grandma's house. It was my dad's childhood home, and I was sitting in my grandpa's old recliner chair. My dad said, when I was sitting in that recliner, I went from acting like a normal child to all of a sudden just sitting there very still and quiet, staring into space. He said I suddenly looked at him and said, "Hey, Fargo," and then went back to being my normal self. Fargo was a nickname that my grandpa used to my dad when he was a kid. I was only a 5-year-old child, so there's absolutely no way that I would ever have heard this name being used. He said it freaked him out pretty bad, so we ended up wrapping the visit up very soon after that. My dad moved around a lot when I was between the ages of 12 and 18 years old. When I was 15, he lived in the foothills of Colorado. Somewhat secluded, but still close enough to the nearest urban neighborhood. One day, I was sitting in the basement playing video games when I heard what sounded like the footsteps of somebody running down the stairs. I had 4 other siblings, so this would have been fairly common. So, I looked over to the stairs to see who it was. All I saw was a flash of blonde hair running towards one of the downstairs bedrooms. I thought nothing of it because my sister had long blonde hair, so I just went back to playing one of my video games. About an hour later, I went upstairs to my dad and asked him where my sister was. I wanted to ask her what she wanted when she came down to our room. He looked at me with a really confused look on his face. He said, "Your sister can't have been anywhere near your room this morning. She's been at her friend's house all morning." My dad ended up getting the house blessed. The next morning, flames shot out from under the stove. But this was blamed on a leaky gas line. A bit later on in life, when I first started dating my wife, we stayed over at her parents' house quite often. My wife grew up in an old farmhouse, which was built by her great-grandparents. One night, while I was asleep in that house, I dreamt that I woke up to an old lady standing over me. She was dressed in clothing that seemed to be dated back to the early 1900s. I could sense an extreme amount of anger coming from this lady, and I definitely didn't feel like I was welcome in that house. I woke up drenched in sweat, and my Apple Watch indicated that my heartbeat was at around 150. I described in great detail the dream to my wife's dad. In turn, he showed me a photograph of my wife's great-grandma. She was, without doubt, the woman that I saw in my dream. He told me she was a very mean and bitter old lady who didn't appreciate having guests in the house. If you've ever experienced anything like this, please let us know in the comments. My church was built in 1875, so it'll be 150 years old next year. It's a big church and has 3 levels, but most of the paranormal activity seems to occur on the top floor, where the sanctuary and offices are. Directly off the sanctuary is a meeting/lunchroom. We call it the GPR room. The choir singers will wait in this room before they come out to service. All the committee meetings are held in that room too, and it seems to be quite a hot spot for activity. None of the ghosts in that church seem to truly like crowds, but my mother cleans the church, and sometimes I like to help her. This means that I'm not very often in that church with lots of other living people. In that GPR room, there's a male ghost who often likes to whisper into your ear, like directly into your ear. And there's never any warning, so he catches you off guard and scares you every single time. His tone almost sounds confused, like he's asking you a question. And if you don't answer his question, he'll repeat the question a minute or two later. But the thing is, it's really quite difficult to understand what he's saying, as the words sound kind of muffled. So you have to tell him, "Sorry sir, I can't hear you," in which case he'll either repeat the question or just leave. He only seems to talk to you when you're alone in that GPR room. Only once did he ever speak to me when there was another person present in that room. At the very least, me, my mother, and my sister have each had experiences in that church with the Whispering Man. I've heard him about 4 times now. In the sanctuary, there used to be 2 green, fancy, felted wooden chairs directly behind the altar. When the altar area was renovated, those chairs were moved to a different part of the sanctuary. Sometimes I'd hear laughter and mumblings of conversation coming from the area where the chairs are now located. These voices definitely belong to women. I'd hear their voices and the pauses in between. One lady would talk, and soon after I'd hear another female voice responding, the voices echoing throughout the sanctuary. Sadly, once again their voices and their words were fairly inaudible. And those chairs were recently sold, so I haven't heard them voices in quite a while. As far as I'm aware, I'm the only one that's ever heard those voices. There's a little girl, no older than 8 years old, and she is the only ghost that fully manifests in that church. She wears a white dress that appears to date back to the late 1800s to early 1900s. She has Shirley Temple style curls and appears like a physical person, only with a very grey complexion. She almost looks like she's straight out of a black and white movie. She can often be spotted playing and giggling right at the back of the sanctuary. But one night last fall, I was sitting in the GPR room practicing for choir, when I looked up into the doorway leading into the hall. I thought I'd seen something in my peripheral vision, and when I looked up, there she was. That little girl was pinching the sides of her dress up so she didn't trip and fall. She was twirling around and around, watching her dress catch the air, flowing elegantly around her as she danced. She had a beaming smile on her face. I just sat there watching her, totally mesmerised. I just sat there smiling to myself with pure joy at the sight of seeing this little girl having so much fun dancing and playing to the sound of the pianist's songs. It was somehow blissful, yet haunting at the same time. I accidentally knocked something over on the desk in front of me. This caught the girl's attention, and she looked up and noticed me watching her. As quickly as that, she suddenly vanished with the blink of an eye. My mother and sister have both heard her giggle, and my mother swears that she saw her running across the back of the sanctuary where she plays. Thankfully, all of the spirits that reside in that church seem to be benevolent by nature, although I'm still not sure I'd like to be there alone in the dark. I want to share a personal experience from a time when I was venturing into an abandoned building. At the end of the story, I'll share a photo with you, in which I appear to have caught something quite disturbing. I am a 20-year-old female. When I was about 14 or 15 years old, me and my friends liked to go to abandoned buildings and be adventurous in our tiny town. We decided to visit this military hospital that was quite popular in our town for kids of our age to explore. At this point, it was pretty much just a junkyard, and looked incredibly spooky at night. My friends went there before me, and told me that they'd found an Ouija board in the attic. This, of course, sparked our curiosity, and we really wanted to go to investigate further. I remember having so much anxiety about the whole situation, and decided to snap a photo of the building before we went in. I was really scared of getting lost on my own in this huge old building. The access to the upstairs from inside the building was full of clutter and stuff to barricade the dangerous steps leading up to the attic. However, somehow we made it up to the attic, and I was the first to walk in. All of a sudden, I was hit with a terrible wave of sickness. I genuinely felt like I was going to puke everywhere, so I stepped aside and let everyone else go in while I waited back. To be honest, the rest of the adventure wasn't nearly as terrifying as the attic. When we got home, I decided to look through all the photos and videos that we took whilst we were exploring. As we were scrolling through the photos, I noticed something in my very first photo that really gave me the chills. See if you can spot anything strange about this photo. If you look closely, you can see a person standing in front of that building staring straight back at us. There was a few of us present at the time, and we all swear that there was nobody else there as we approached that building. We've been through all the photos and footage, and nobody else was wearing the same clothing that the person in this photograph was wearing. My mum has a friend that claims to have medium abilities. This lady had a look at the photo. She insisted that this entity was conjured to the building because my friends took that Ouija board. Please let me know what you think. Did we catch a ghost on camera? Do you have any photographs where you think you've caught something of a paranormal nature? Before I tell this story, I'd like to start by saying that I'm a huge believer in the paranormal. I've been having paranormal encounters and experiences since I was a child. I love things of a paranormal nature. I have a ghost tattoo, and I named my cat Boo. I own ghost hunting equipment, and I've been ghost hunting everywhere from Savannah, Georgia to California. It's my passion. The amount of paranormal or unexplained stories I have are countless, and most of them are harmless. But one encounter made me take a step back from paranormal investigations for quite some time. This is the story of what happened that night. It was 10 p.m. on the 8th of May 2020. I got into my car to go to pick my little sister up from her friend's house, which was only about 8 minutes from where we lived. I got into my car like normal, started the engine, and proceeded to drive to her house. It's important to point out that immediately, as soon as I got into my car, something didn't quite feel right. I chalked it up to the fact that I was driving a car without a license, but I couldn't shake this feeling off. Because of this unsettling feeling I had, I never turned any music on and decided to drive in silence. I wanted to be extra careful and really aware of my surroundings. It's also important to know that me and my best friend have always said that flashing lights, or flickering lights in general, are kind of an ominous warning. This is due to past experiences. So I'm driving through this neighbourhood that I've been through a million times. Out of the corner of my eye as I'm driving, I notice this porch light turn on and off, on and off. I said to myself out loud, "Okay, I see you." But I didn't really think that much of it, and continued on my way to pick up my little sister. Eventually, I came to a stop sign. And again, the street light above me turned off and on, off and on. I froze for a moment just staring at that light. I took a deep breath and continued driving. Eventually, I reached the turning for the road that she lives on. I took the turn and started driving down the road. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed somebody's garage floodlights flickering on and off alarmingly fast. So fast, I thought the bulb was about to blow. I stared out of my driver window and slowed down as I looked at this light. My head was out the window as I approached a rolling stop. I was totally caught off guard. Out of the corner of my eye, I could clearly see somebody sitting in the seat behind my passenger seat in my car. My heart froze, and I knew I needed to double check what I'd seen. I stopped my car completely in the middle of the road to turn all the way around. Clear as day, there was a man sitting on the back seat of my car, and I can describe him to a T. His head was down, but he had blonde hair parted to the side. His arm was resting on the armrest of the door. I can't quite remember his clothing, but I do remember that I was incredibly scared. I was staring at him in total shock, when all of a sudden he jerked his head up and stared straight back at me. His eyes looked incredibly sunken. His whole face, in fact, looked kind of distorted. He had a really long pointy nose and bushy eyebrows. I could tell that he was very tall, abnormally tall in fact, because his knees were up so high they were practically against his chest. He didn't say a word, but I could hear his breathing, and I could see his chest rising and falling with each breath. He was there, and I could see every detail of him. There was no way on earth it was my imagination, and I stared at him for what felt like days, when in reality it was probably no more than 15 seconds. I must have glanced away for no more than a second, when all of a sudden he was gone. I didn't see him fade away or anything like that. 1 second he was there, and then he wasn't. I got out of my car and looked all around, outside and inside, but I found nobody. I was so confused and absolutely convinced that there was a living, breathing man sitting on the back seat of my car. The worst thing was the way he made me feel. I've seen ghosts before, and in my experience they never tend to acknowledge me, and very rarely do they give off a negative energy, but he did. When I was looking at him, time seemed to freeze. I really felt like I was in danger. The feeling was incredibly ominous. I really felt like he wanted to hurt me, There's no doubt about it. It was malevolent. I got back in my car and continued the drive to my sister. I picked her up and we headed home. I was holding back the tears and shaking like a leaf. The thing was, I knew deep down the whole drive that something wasn't right. I knew I wasn't alone the whole drive, and I knew that those flashing lights were a warning sign. That man absolutely scared the hell out of me. I came home and broke down into tears trying to tell this story. After this happened, I went to visit a medium and sold the car immediately. I stopped ghost hunting for a good while. What do you think this was? To begin, I'd have to mention that the house is an old farmhouse. It's set out in the country, with farm acreage at the front and state lands at the back. It's a fantastic location, with only a 10-minute drive into the nearest town. We only have one close neighbour, so it's pretty private for most part. The previous owner had bought the house on an estate auction. An elderly lady grew up in the house, and along with the house she owned many acres of land. I was told she died right here in this house, and I found her a few days later. I also heard that her son died here in this house too. Apparently he hung himself in the garage, although that was never actually confirmed. The house has been renovated many times through its different owners, including myself, but I'm not entirely sure how old the house is. I've attempted to look into the history of the house, and I believe it's very old. I think it was built sometime in the early 1900s. After we bought the house, we heard stories from the previous owners that the house might be haunted. I never, in my wildest dreams, imagined that this could be true. My first experience was when our dog was in the living room late one night. She was whimpering like she was afraid of something and staring at one of the walls, or maybe even one of the bottom rooms, but I couldn't see anything. I thought this was really odd and called her over to me. One day, I was taking a shower when I heard someone tapping on the door handle. The handle was pretty loose and could only make that sound if you pressed on it or tapped it downwards. I shouted, "Just a minute!" Then opened the door, thinking one of my kids needed to use the bathroom. But there was no one there. I asked everyone who had tried to enter the bathroom, and they all said at that point they were outside playing. I've always been on the skeptical side, so I just kind of brushed it off. There just had to be a logical explanation, surely. There is one room in that house, however, that does make me question my beliefs. Whoever has slept in that room has felt the bed shift violently, as if it's been pushed or kicked. It's also been said by people sleeping in that room that they felt someone sit on the side of the bed, but when they look, there's nobody there. All three of my kids, who are all grown up now, say that they've experienced this while sleeping in that room at some stage in life. The funny thing is, they all didn't learn about this until years later. I had told my son not to tell my youngest daughter, as she might be too afraid to sleep in that room. Eventually, we came to find that she had experienced it too. My husband has heard someone calling his name while he was sleeping, at least 7 times within a 3-month period. He's also heard footsteps walking around downstairs when he's been home alone. One time in particular, I'd just gone home from work and I was talking to my husband. As we were talking, my cell phone started to ring. When I looked at the screen, we were both in absolute shock. Our house phone was calling my cell phone. We both looked at each other, panicked. We knew that we were the only people in that house. I asked him, "Did you try calling me before I got home? And maybe that's why the house phone is calling me back." Of course, he said no, and that would have been very weird. On another occasion, I heard my daughter's voice calling out to me, "Mom," when she wasn't even home. My husband also heard my daughter call out the word "Mom" too, when he was also home alone. We thought it was my son at first, but when we checked, there was nobody there. Only once did I ever feel scared when I was home alone. I had just come home from work and was relaxing when all of a sudden I heard some really loud banging coming from upstairs. It was coming from one of the bedrooms, and it was pretty loud. It was 10:30 p.m. by this time, so I was really freaked out. Initially thinking it was an intruder, I rushed to the kitchen and grabbed the largest kitchen knife we had. I kept looking up the stairs, wondering if maybe I should go and investigate to find out what had made such a loud noise. My husband was at work, so I called my son, who was at a party 30 minutes away. I told him what had happened and that I was freaking out, so he came back home with several of his friends to the house. They were all carrying weapons and did a full sweep of the house, inside and out. My son even checked the crawl space underneath the house. As it turned out, they didn't find or see anything that could have made that noise, and there definitely wasn't any intruders. I felt safe knowing that there wasn't anybody inside the house, but I know what I heard. Something caused that banging. I've heard the wooden floor creaking as if somebody's walking on it from just 10 feet away, with nobody in sight. I've never really felt a bad vibe, other than that time with the banging upstairs, and I've never really felt scared. If you've ever experienced anything like this, let us know in the comment section. My very first paranormal experience happened when I was 7, and we'd just moved into a small farmhouse in New Hampton, New York. The house still stands today, albeit in disrepair, but it is still there. When we first moved in, it was a series of spider webs and dirty floors. The attic was full of stuff that the previous owners didn't want, and the bedroom that I would share with my 3 sisters was full of stuff as well. We found dolls from the 1920s, old newspapers, and an entire series of Life magazine in pristine condition, all of which they let my mum sell. It took us weeks to clear all of the boxes out of that room. We had no curtains on the 2 windows to the right, which my sister slept under. The moon shone straight through, illuminating right up to the edge of my bed. We had those thin blankets with one edge that has silk on it. I lay there under my thin blanket, hoping that sleep would soon find me. Just as I started to doze off, I heard heavy breathing coming from the right side, down past the windows. It was slowly making its way towards me. Assuming it was one of my sisters, I yelled, "Knock it off!" It went quiet, and I fell asleep soon after. The second night, my sisters were sound asleep, and that laboured breathing started again. It was raspy, desperate, and once again slowly creeping towards me. So I sat up, and once again I yelled, "Knock it off!" and lay back down, expecting it to stop, just as it had the night before. This time, however, it did not stop. It just seemed to get heavier and darker, and kept creeping towards me. So I sat up again. The full moon was illuminating the entire area, the breathing was coming from. I thought, this time I'll see which of my sisters is trying to scare me. And again I yelled, "Stop it!" Now, I could see most of the room, and nothing was there but that dark, raspy, terrifying breathing creeping closer and closer to the end of my bed. I could clearly see that there was nothing there. I quickly laid back down, shaking in fear, and covered myself with my thin sheets. Horrified and terrified as each breath crept closer and closer to me, inch by horrifying inch. I don't remember falling asleep that night, but I do remember that breathing remained by the side of my bed, and I was too afraid to look. The next night, the same thing happened again, only this time it was moving towards me a lot quicker. Again, I yelled for my sisters to knock it off as I sat up. Again, the moon cast its light on that side of the room, but there was nothing there but that deep, dark, nasty breathing heading my way. It approached my bed, and I could hear it crystal clear, but there was nothing there. I went flat so fast and pulled the covers over my head. It seemed to work last night. I prayed it would work again tonight. But this time, it inched closer and closer, and seemed to get more and more desperate and grotesque. Now, it was right next to my bed. It began leaning over me, breathing harder and harder as it got closer. Suddenly, I could feel hot breath upon my face. That terrifying breathing was now right on top of me, and I was shaking with fear. I figured it had to be me. It just had to be my own hot breath coming back at me from inside the sheets. So, I decided to hold my breath, but that horrible, raspy breathing just continued. I held my breath tighter, and that breathing seemed to stop for a second. Then, I heard it take in a large, desperate breath before it blew hard through my blanket. I froze, absolutely terrified. I figured this just had to be one of my sisters because I was holding my breath. Then it happened again. So I whipped my blanket down as fast as I could so I could see what was hovering over me. The room was illuminated perfectly, but to my horror, there was nobody there. Then, all of a sudden, right in front of my face, what disgusting raspy breath blew straight at my face with nothing in front of me. I could feel it, I could hear it, and I could smell it. I screamed in horror, shaking and crying, and jumped out of bed and ran as fast as I could. It was hard for my family to calm me down after that. I know what I experienced, and I know it was real. It was absolutely terrifying. In the 5 or 6 years we lived in that rental, not once did I ever set foot back in that room. Not once. I wouldn't even step across the threshold. It was shortly after my experience we found out an old man lived in that place alone. He lived there alone for years after his wife had passed away, and he died in that room, amongst his hoard of boxes and possessions. None of my sisters ever had that experience. I never had it again, but I avoided that room like the plague. This experience definitely sparked an interest in the paranormal. So, has this ever happened to you? Disembodied, ghostly breathing. I will never, ever forget it. I'm now 62 years old, and I remember it like it was yesterday. That wraps things up for today. I really hope those stories gave you the chills. If you have any thoughts on today's stories, please leave them in the comments section down below. Please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel for a feast of grim and grisly content. As always, thanks for watching. I'm your host, Severed Soul.